We caught up with Zach at the Aspen Ideas Festival in the beautiful Rocky Mountains of Aspen, Colorado. He still spends much of his time in China, which has now become his second home. What I found fascinating about your book is just the sense of determination. Here's a kid who really struggles with Mandarin, who goes to Hong Kong, and it's, you know, like for me, I've struggled with it, and believe me, I'm going to be struggling until the day I die. It's not an easy language. So that took a lot of courage on your part. Talk to me about going there and doing it.
Sure, it's a mixture of courage and stupidity. I didn't fully understand all that it would take to be able to really try to dive deep into China, the language, the culture, and not just China of the first tier cities. So I knew very clearly that I didn't want to just be another sort of suburban Ivy League kid who smiles his way into a consulting job. I woke up every morning after coming back from Hong Kong thinking, wow, China is the most exciting thing that I've ever experienced. When I actually went, I went with a backpack, the address of a hostel, nothing else. I didn't speak the language. I didn't know anybody. I didn't have a job set up. And I truly did not think much about what it would take to put all those things in place. It might be one of my better qualities. I leap before I look. And in this case, again, when I went, I certainly wasn't imagining this book. I certainly wasn't imagining being here talking with you. And so it's been a bit of trying to figure out the mess I get myself into as I go.
After graduation, Zach moved to China with no plans except to explore the country and its people. Over the next 4 years, he traveled thousands of miles throughout eastern megacities like Guangzhou and Beijing, but also explored China's interior, places like Chengdu, and he also visited smaller cities like Shangri-La. Over this time, he learned Mandarin, but also became fluent in the ways of the Chinese people, especially their millennials. Zach also realized that the China we talk about in the West is far different from the new, futuristic China he saw emerging. This discovery inspired him to write the book Young China: How the Restless Generation Will Change Their Country and the World. Zach recently relocated to New York City, where he founded a think tank and consultancy focused on young China.
Most of the learning was realizing what was unlearning. We have these ideas of China, and this was honestly a large impetus for ultimately writing the book. China's described to us a way in the media that's one of two ways. Either one, a big government, which the way it's described is often kind of scary. Two is a big economy, which is exciting. And these days, honestly, increasingly sort of adversarial. But then when you're actually there, when you're on the ground, when you're interacting with people, neither version of those Chinas prepare you for understanding the people. And you don't think about that when you're here. You don't think, you think about, okay, government and economics, I kind of get it. But when you're there, most of what I knew about China didn't help me. And in fact, the amount of unlearning I had to do made it so that the early learning was more confusing than it was clarifying. The deeper I got, and I really made big efforts to, I spurned most of the expat communities. I was really trying to get myself into it, feel the feelings, taste the taste, get in the heartbeat of this young generation in China. And it was an impulse that I certainly did not believe would lead to a book. But ultimately, after years being there and continuing to have interactions east and west, that felt broken. The need and the responsibility to put this book out into the world, to try to build that, I think of what I do as bridge work, building understanding between China and the world. It felt essential. And ultimately, it was my Chinese friends who convinced me to give it a go.
And it's interesting because that bridge building is taking place here. I watched your presentation earlier today, and it's a different spin on China because you're right. There are those two spins that you talked about, and yours is somewhere else. And one of the things you talked about was GDP and what the young people there have witnessed. Talk to us about some of the points you were trying to get across today.
There are three main points I talked about today. The first is,
how well equipped are you to understand young China? When I say young China, I actually mean two things. On one hand, we of course have young people. I'm an American millennial. Everyone's sort of obsessed with who we are, what we stand for, what we want to buy, who are we going to vote for, are we going to vote at all, what are we loyal to, have we ever been loyal to anything? There's about 80 million of us. There are 417 million millennials in China. 5 times more than what we have in the United States. There's actually more young people in China than there are people in the United States and Canada combined. It's young China number 1. The second definition of young China, and I think this one's more interesting actually, is a sort of old culture, an old idea of what it means to be Chinese, most recently driven by poverty and frankly, communism, redefining its identity on the world stage today. And this young generation, they're the pathfinders for the future of China, for young China, for the identity of China that we're going to be seeing in the next 5 to 10 years.
The second point I talk about, and this is China speed and generation gulfs.
I'm often asked, what's the most distinct characteristic of this young generation in China? And this one really comes to mind first. And for those of you who can't see in back, I'm going to explain what this is. This is a graph of the per capita GDP change, the amount of times it's increased since 1990. So I was born in 1990 in California, and in my lifetime, I've watched our per capita GDP, so not a perfect measure, but a basic unit for what a life gets you in a place. I've watched it increase 2.5 times in my lifetime. So maybe the education my parents could provide for me, 2.5 times better. The cars my neighbors drove, 2.5 times faster. The trips we could take, 2.5 times longer. You kind of get the gist. My friends in China born in the exact same year have watched their per capita GDP increase 27 times in their lifetime. Maybe it's just a developing country thing. What about India? Massive economy, education-oriented. 5. Germany, robust economy, 1.9. Brazil, BRICS country, 3.2. In fact, when you look at the top 60 performing economies of today, you'll notice a trend. When people ask me what China's speed is, I point to this graph. You guys can see here that pretty much everywhere else in the world moves at a certain pace since 1990. The amount of change, the amount of growth that millennials across the world have witnessed in their lifetime is more or less the same. It's the single digits. And if you're wondering what China's speed looks like, if you're wondering what it takes to keep up with China, and particularly this young generation, this is China right here.
The third and final point I brought up today was the idea of Easternization.
If you guys were to open up your Microsoft Word and type in Westernization, they'd capitalize the W for you. It's an idea we have in our heads. If you were to write Easternization, you'd get the red squiggly lines underneath, error. It's not a concept in our vocabulary.
We have something I call the Shanghai fallacy, which is a lot of Western executives, Western business people, even Western travelers, they go to Shanghai, they have an interaction with a wonderful English-speaking guide who has spent most of their lives, honestly, immersing themselves in foreign language and foreign culture just so they could have that conversation with that tourist or executive. They sit in a beautiful restaurant on the Bund, they have a great steak, they have a glass of wine, they look out, they read all the brands they recognize, they ignore the ones they don't, and they go back thinking, okay, for China, modernization means Westernization. What's so interesting about China is because of its economic and political clout, there's going to be a little bit more cultural gravity. It's the first Eastern power that as it's modernized, might actually start to change the way that our world spins. And so this young generation is the first generation in modern China that gets to decide, okay, what does it mean to be Chinese? Does it have to be, what's the relationship with the West? What do we like, what do we don't? What don't we like? What do we want to keep from our culture, or what do we want to try something that's new? That process, what is the modern Chinese identity, is being defined today, and this young generation is at the forefront of that process.
But Easternization, that's not a message that's well received in the West, is it? I mean, that's a tough sell because they kind of like those two pockets that you talked about, and they're comfortable there. This is an area where perhaps they're not as comfortable.
It'd be great if we don't have to change our marketing materials for Chinese kids and they just were to become like our kids, right? That would be easy. It's a threat for most people, and it doesn't have to be, by the way, but we take it as that. When you think of the world's big consumer markets, when you think of the world's big political powers, what comes to mind? You have the United States, you have Germany, you have France, you have the UK. Particularly on the consumption side, those 4 countries kind of do things the same way. You know, if you're in the tourism world, Germans eat dark bread in the morning. Americans, we like our coffee a certain way. Not that different ultimately. But China, because they do have this cultural identity that's distinctly apart, for many of us it represents a threat. You You guys don't want to do work the same way that we want to do work. You guys aren't interested in trade maybe the same way that we imagine it. And you're not just bending to the way we see things. And it doesn't have to be adversarial, by the way. Unfortunately, many of us, especially I think in America, we're not used to having to accommodate different cultures. We're not used to having to accommodate different ways of seeing the world. We expect most of the world to accommodate our worldview. Might not play out that way with China.
Zach believes that perception might also be changed by millennials. The younger generation loves to travel and study abroad, but knows its future lies in China. So it's not surprising that although thousands of Chinese study overseas every year, many of them return knowing there are more opportunities in China. They like to engage with the world, whether it's through travel or education, but they want to bring their experiences back and apply them at home.
Well, let me talk to you about the worldview, because one of the people that you talk about in this book is a gentleman by the name of Tom, and Tom says even with the firewall, he feels like he understands the world and America better than America understands China.
There's no doubt. And I really do think of this as an understanding deficit. You know, I have friends in China who have really grown up on American culture. Breaking Bad. I could have more conversations about Breaking Bad and Friends. And you know, we always focus on like the economy and the politics, but so much of who a place is not that. So much of who a people is has nothing to do with macroeconomics and government, honestly. And because of our cultural exports and because of this young generation's hunger for those, they've grown up learning a lot about not just who we are as a world power, as a hegemonic power, but who we are as people, what we like to watch, what, you know, the way we dress, how we talk to one another. If you were to challenge every single person at the Aspen Institute today to answer who is one of China's top 5 best known musical artists, not one person would know. If you were to ask the Aspen Institute today, certainly 5 years ago, maybe less so today, who is the president of China? Honestly, I would guess half would stumble. And what does that mean? There's not a willingness. That's not entirely fair. And in part, it's not there's not a willingness to learn about China, absolutely. But also China's cultural and linguistic distance from us, from who we are, makes it so that even if you are willing to learn, even if you are wanting to engage with China, you don't really know how to do it. So this question, how well equipped are you to understand young China? It's not just how much do you want to understand young China. There's some equipment, there's some tools that are necessary in order to approach this young generation and really try to lead with understanding.
Zach points out that Chinese millennials are willing to take risks. More than 200,000 students turned into entrepreneurs in 2017. That's according to Peking University. With the Chinese economy comfortably coasting along, the younger generation is tapping into opportunities in sectors as varied as high-end fashion and online retail. In between Zach's packed day presenting, we were able to take a quick walk around the Aspen Ideas Festival's campus.
We have this idea that there's a single child generation in China. And because of the 4-2-1 structure, right? 4 grandparents, 2 parents, 1 child, you have this upside down pyramid, and that kind of works like a funnel. A funnel for love, a funnel for attention, a funnel for resources. And so that's how you get the Xiao Huangdi, the little emperor perspective. These kids spoiled rotten by an excess of love, an excess of attention. Everything they want, they get. That's true, but it's a double-edged sword. With those resources, with those opportunities comes an incredible amount of responsibility, of expectations, all on you. And that level of competition, that level of pressure, is one of the most recurring themes I consistently encountered all across the country that we in the West more or less just miss. We think of this great consumer class, all right, everything they want, they get. Or we think of these students who sort of come here, leave, and we don't hear much from them. We don't think about the amount of pressure on the shoulders of this young generation in China.